Okay, we've got Professor Carter Snead from the Notre Dame School of Law, a friend of mine. He spoke at the Notre Dame Vita Institute, the first annual event, 2-week immersion in education on pro-life. It was fantastic. And he's taking over for the Center for Ethics and Culture for Notre Dame in July. It's Professor Snead.
Thanks very much. It's a real honor to be here, and this is a time of year, as you all know, that is, even though it's a sad and shameful thing that we're marking with the anniversary of Roe v. Wade, it's always energizing and uplifting to meet other people, especially people you've never met before, who share your devotion to the unborn child and their mothers as well. And so thank you for coming. It's a real honor to be here. I agree with everything that everyone said thus far as well. Being an academic, and my own contribution today to discussing the measurable and achievable ways that we can affect the community is a kind of conceptual proposal, not so much a concrete initiative, but rather to try to urge a way of talking about this question, the question of life and the respect for all human beings, in a way that I think, at least it's proven out with my law students, with the folks at the university who we've been able to touch, and minds that we've been able to change, a way of talking about it that resonates with them. And what I'm suggesting is that we should draw upon the foundational concept of basic human equality. It's something, people talk about dignity, people talk about the sanctity of life, people talk about respect for life. In my experience, especially with law students, lawyers, professionals that work in the law, there's a kind of an intuitive resonance with the principle of equality. And the good news is that the biology and the science, modern science, has confirmed that the unborn child is as much of one of us as anyone in this room is. From the moment of conception, you have a full, integrated, self-directing human life. And so the question isn't when life begins, but when should moral regard and legal protection be ascribed to that child. And once you make that point, I think, and ground it in the concept of human equality, you sort of catch people off guard. It's not a religious argument. It's a kind of foundational, sort of liberal democratic theory argument that we're familiar with. It's grounded in the foundational instruments of our country, like the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and our basic laws. And it seems to me that appealing to this principle of equality can, as I say, surprise people because it's so intuitive. And if you frame the issue as saying, listen, you have sort of a pool of humanity, and the question that abortion invites you to answer, the question that embryo-destructive research invites you to answer is, how are we going to divide the world up into who counts and who doesn't count? And I think it flies in the face of basic moral intuition to say that the strong should divide the world up into who counts and who doesn't according to their own interests. And when you frame it that way, I mean, you can't argue with the proposition that these embryos and fetuses are human beings. They're living, breathing human beings. And again, the question is, how do we draw the world up into who counts and who doesn't? And is it really right to let the strong divide that world up in a way that accords with their own interests? And I think that this is, I found this argument to be effective, again, with law students in the legal context and at UNESCO and at the UN and other places, where people who are not religious, people who are not in the habit of thinking about the pro-life principles, but who are in the habit of thinking about equality and human rights, and once they understand that this is the most fundamental human rights question that's facing us in the 21st century, it at least gets their attention. And the other salutary effect of focusing on equality as a principle in this particular area is that it shows the perversity of the left's argument in favor of abortion rights. As you all know, it used to be privacy, then it was liberty, and now the left and the legal commentariat, the Supreme Court justices, the professors, the opinion makers, have settled on the idea of equality to justify the right to kill an unborn child. And if you explain the issue and you frame it in terms of equality, you see how perverse that is. The idea that equality for women depends on entrenching radical inequality of the weakest and most vulnerable members of the human family. You can't live with that kind of cognitive dissonance, I don't think. If you really understand it and you're intellectually honest, and that's not to say that everybody who we're in conversation with is intellectually honest. But those who are, and the people who are misguided, the people who don't want to think about abortion or embryo-destructive research, because it's frankly quite unpleasant to think about, if you frame it in that way, my experience has been that sometime a light goes on. A light goes on and people say, yeah, you know, it really is. I mean, if embryos are people too, which of course they are, how can it be the case that in a country like ours, We live in a regime where it's free license to kill and destroy the weakest and most vulnerable in the interests of others. Because someone else, because they're small, because they're vulnerable, because they're dependent, because somebody else thinks they're more valuable dead than alive, because they're going to be killed anyway. We should be able to kill them and destroy them for our own purposes. Those are perverted and insane ideas if you internalize the proposition that we're talking about as human beings. And there's no argument about that, really. There's no, I mean, science has ripped the mask away. There's no argument about, well, we don't know when life begins. We do know when life begins. The question is when moral regard and legal protection should attach. And I realize, and I think that in our own micro relationships with other people, I mean, we talk about this stuff all the time amongst ourselves, as previous speakers have said. But there are moments when it comes up, especially in a political campaign, a campaign year, people are going to be talking about abortion a lot, and embryo-destructive research a lot. Take the opportunities to speak with your neighbors about it, and to show that that you're coming from a position of respect for the intrinsic basic equality of all human beings. How can you possibly be on the wrong side of that question? How could anyone be on the wrong side of that question? And so I think that is a good, concrete, and measurable way of engaging one's own community, one's own family members who may not think about it in the right way. It strikes me that this is an important and tangible kind of conceptual approach that should shape our arguments and our engagement with others.